In the 20th century, humanity embarked on its two greatest adventures of exploration. One was outward, a journey into the vast, silent darkness of outer space, to the moon and beyond. The other was inward, a journey into the equally vast and equally unknown territory of the human psyche. If the first journey had its astronauts and its physicists, the second had its own kind of explorer, a man who was part psychiatrist, part philosopher, part mystic, and part adventurer. A man who descended deeper into the inner world than almost anyone before him and returned with a new map of the soul. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. Jung was not just another psychologist, he was a cartographer of the soul. His life's work was a radical and courageous attempt to map the full, breathtaking, and often terrifying landscape of our inner lives. And his most revolutionary discovery, the idea that would form the foundation of his entire system, was this: your psyche, your mind, is not just yours. He argued that beneath the thin, fragile surface of our conscious ego, and even beneath the layer of our personal memories and repressed experiences, there lies a much deeper, much older, and much vaster foundation. A psychic bedrock that is common to all human beings. He called it the collective unconscious. This masterclass is a journey into that hidden territory. It is an exploration of the map that Jung created, a map of the myths, the symbols, the instincts, and the primordial patterns that secretly govern our lives from the depths of this shared, universal mind. But this was not a map drawn from the safety of an academic library. Jung's biographical agony was that he was not just the mapmaker, he was the first and most daring explorer of the territory itself. His work was born from his own direct, courageous, and often terrifying confrontation with the raw power of the unconscious. He did not just theorize about this hidden world, he journeyed into it. He wrestled with its strange and powerful inhabitants, and the map he brought back was drawn in the ink of his own personal experience, his own spiritual crisis, and his own profound journey of healing and transformation. His work, therefore, is not just a psychological theory, it is a guide for the greatest of all human adventures, the quest to become a whole, complete, and integrated individual. It is an attempt to answer some of the deepest and most persistent questions of our existence. Why do the same myths, the same symbols, the same religious ideas appear in different cultures all over the world, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years? What is the true meaning and purpose of our dreams? Are they just random neural firings, or are they a direct communication from a deeper, wiser part of ourselves? In a modern, secular world that has often lost its connection to traditional myths and religions, how can we find a genuine and authentic sense of meaning and purpose? And finally, what does it mean to become a whole human being? How do we confront the darkness within ourselves, integrate the warring opposites of our nature, and fulfill our unique potential? To guide our journey through this vast and challenging landscape, our masterclass will be divided into 5 major phases. First, we will explore the man and the map of the soul. We will look at Jung's life, his revolutionary break with his mentor Sigmund Freud, and his new model of the psyche, including the personal and collective unconscious. Next, we will meet the archetypes, the primordial inhabitants of this collective unconscious. We will explore the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, and the ultimate goal of our journey, the archetype of the self. Then, we will chart the course of the journey of a lifetime, individuation. We will look at Jung's model of the two halves of life, the meaning of the midlife crisis, and the lifelong quest to become a whole and unique individual. After that, we will examine the tools and the typology. We will explore Jung's practical methods, like dream analysis and his famous theory of psychological types, which gave us the concepts of introverts and extraverts. Finally, we will conclude with the legacy of the cartographer, looking at Jung's own personal ordeal as documented in his Red Book, and tracing his immense and growing influence on psychology, spirituality, and modern culture. This is the great paradoxical promise of Jung's work. He teaches us that the most important journey of discovery is not the one that leads to the distant stars, but the one that leads into the uncharted depths of our own soul. The map to understanding the future of humanity, he believed, was hidden in the oldest and most universal myths of our ancient past. To understand the world, we must first understand the self. And to understand the self, we must be willing to embark on a courageous journey into the unknown. Every great explorer begins their journey with the maps of those who came before. And for Carl Jung, and for the entire world of early 20th century psychology, there was only one mapmaker, one towering and unavoidable figure, who had first dared to chart the dark continent of the unconscious. That man was Sigmund Freud. The story of Jung cannot be told without the story of Freud. Their relationship was the central drama of Jung's early life, a profound and complex bond that was part intellectual collaboration, part deep friendship, and part a classic, tragic story of a father and the son who must ultimately overthrow him. When they first met in Vienna in 1907, the connection was electric. Freud was the established revolutionary, the controversial founder of psychoanalysis. Jung was the brilliant young psychiatrist from the prestigious Berg-Hölzli Clinic in Zurich, a rising star who had already been using Freud's methods with his own patients. Their first conversation, famously, lasted for 13 hours straight. It was a meeting of two of the most powerful minds of the century. Freud saw in Jung not just a brilliant colleague, but an heir. He called him his crown prince, the man who would carry the banner of psychoanalysis into the future. For Freud, who was battling a hostile and skeptical medical establishment, Jung was the perfect successor. He was not Jewish, he was not part of the inner Viennese circle, and he had the institutional credibility to give the movement the mainstream legitimacy it desperately needed. For a time, Jung embraced this role. He became Freud's most passionate disciple and his most important collaborator. But from the very beginning, there were seeds of a profound intellectual disagreement, two fundamental points of conflict that would eventually tear their relationship and the entire psychological world apart. The first conflict was over the nature of the libido. For Freud, the libido was the central driving force of the human psyche. And it was, at its root, almost exclusively sexual energy. Our deepest motivations, our neuroses, our dreams, all of it, he argued, could ultimately be traced back to the repressed sexual desires of our infancy and childhood. This was the cornerstone of his entire system. Jung, from his own clinical experience and his own self-analysis, found this to be too narrow, too restrictive. He saw the libido not just as sexual energy, but as a more generalized psychic energy, a fundamental life force. He saw this energy manifesting in many ways, not just in sexuality, but in the drive for creativity, the hunger for power, and most importantly for Jung, in the deep human need for spiritual and religious experience. To reduce all of this rich complexity to the single engine of sexuality felt, to Jung, like a profound and reductive error. The second, and far more critical, disagreement was over the nature of the unconscious itself. For Freud, the unconscious was primarily personal. It was like the basement of a house. It was a dark, hidden cellar where we store all the personal junk of our own lives, our repressed traumas, our unacceptable desires, our shameful secrets, all the things that are too painful or too threatening for the conscious mind to acknowledge. Jung agreed that this personal basement existed. He called it the personal unconscious, but he came to believe, through his study of myths, of fairy tales, of religious symbols, and of the dreams and fantasies of his patients, that beneath this personal basement lay something far deeper, far older, and far more mysterious. He believed that beneath the cellar lay the ancient foundations of the house itself, a primordial structure that was not unique to the individual, but was shared by all of humanity. This was his great discovery. This was the collective unconscious. These two disagreements over the nature of energy and the depth of the unconscious created an inevitable and growing tension between the two men. Freud saw Jung's ideas as a retreat from the hard, uncomfortable truths of his own discoveries, a dangerous flirtation with mysticism. Jung saw Freud's insistence on sexuality as a dogmatic and unscientific obsession, a new kind of religion with Freud as its infallible pope. The break, when it finally came, was not a polite academic parting of ways. It was a brutal and emotionally devastating schism. It was a psychological patricide. The biographical agony for Jung was immense. To break with Freud was to betray his father figure, the man who had championed him and anointed him as his successor. It meant being excommunicated from the only significant psychological movement in the world. It meant being publicly denounced by his former mentor and colleagues. It cast him out into a profound intellectual and professional wilderness. He was, for a time, completely and utterly alone. And it was in this period of painful isolation, following the final break in 1913, that Jung's true life's work began. Stripped of the certainty of Freud's map, he had no choice but to draw his own. And the only territory he had left to explore was the terrifying unknown landscape of his own soul. This painful separation precipitated his famous creative illness, a multi-year period of intense psychological crisis that he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. He had lost his father figure, his professional certainties, and his own sense of direction. He was adrift, and so he made the courageous choice to turn inward and to face the powerful, archetypal forces that were erupting from his own depths. And so, in this painful personal act of rebellion, modern psychology was fractured, and Jung's true life's work began. He had to betray the father to become himself. He had to abandon the only map that existed to discover a new continent. The break with Freud was the end of his career as an heir, but it was the necessary and agonizing birth of his destiny as a pioneer. He had to be cast out into the wilderness to finally find his way home. That painful, liberating break with Freud cast Jung out into the wilderness. He was a cartographer without a map, an explorer without a compass in the most dangerous and unknown territory of all, the human soul. To find his way, he had no choice but to draw a new map of the mind. A map born not from theory, but from his own courageous and often terrifying descent into the unknown. And the structure he discovered was far grander, far stranger, and far more ancient than anyone had ever imagined. This is Jung's model of the psyche. He began with the part of ourselves that we know best, the part we think of as me. This is the ego. The ego is the center of our conscious awareness. It is our sense of personal identity, the executive manager of our daily lives. It is the part of you that is listening to my voice right now, that remembers your name, that organizes your thoughts, and that makes deliberate choices. For most of us, and for most of psychology before Jung, the ego was the whole picture. We assumed that the conscious mind was the master of the house. But Jung, through his work with his patients and through his own self-exploration, came to see that the ego was only a tiny, fragile island in the middle of a vast and powerful psychic ocean. His great metaphor for the psyche is the iceberg. The ego is the small visible tip that projects above the water. It is the part that is in the light. But the vast majority of the psyche, the immense, powerful, and determining mass, lies hidden below the surface, in the darkness of the unconscious. The first layer of this submerged world he called the personal unconscious. This is the territory that Freud had so brilliantly begun to explore. The personal unconscious is the basement of your own individual life. It is the storehouse for everything that your ego has forgotten, repressed, or failed to notice. It contains your forgotten childhood memories, your subliminal perceptions, and most importantly, the experiences that were too painful or too shameful for your conscious mind to deal with, which have been pushed down into the darkness. But for Jung, this was not just a trash bin of repressed trauma. It also contained undeveloped parts of our personality, positive potentials that we had not yet lived out. And within this personal unconscious, Jung identified powerful, emotionally charged clusters of energy. He called them complexes. A complex is like a psychic knot, a splinter in the soul. It is a collection of memories, feelings, and ideas that are all bound together by a single powerful emotion. You might have a mother complex, a power complex, or an inferiority complex. These complexes act like little sub-personalities. They can be autonomous, they can hijack the ego, and make us say and do things that are completely irrational. When you have an emotional overreaction to a situation, when you find yourself caught in a compulsive and destructive pattern of behavior, Jung would say that you have been constellated by a complex. It has taken you over. This layer, the personal unconscious with its complexes, was familiar territory to the psychoanalysts of his day. But it is what Jung discovered beneath this layer that would become his most revolutionary and most controversial contribution to human thought. He came to believe that if you drill down deep enough through the personal basement of an individual's life, you eventually break through the floor, and you find yourself in a much larger, much older, and much stranger space. A space that is not personal at all, but is universal. He called it the collective unconscious. This was Jung's great discovery. He argued that just as we are born with a physical body that has been shaped by millions of years of evolution, a body that has a heart, lungs, and a brain that are common to all humans, we are also born with a psychic structure that has been shaped by the cumulative experience of our ancestors. The collective unconscious is our psychic inheritance. It is the shared, timeless, and universal foundation of the human mind itself. It is not a blank slate at birth. It is a vast, ancient reservoir, filled with the latent memories, the instincts, and the wisdom of the entire human species. It is the source of the great primordial patterns and images that have haunted and guided humanity since the dawn of time. These patterns are the archetypes, which we will explore in our next part. How did he arrive at this incredible idea? He saw the evidence everywhere. He saw it in the myths and fairy tales of different cultures. Why, he asked, do we find the same story patterns, the hero's journey, the great flood, the dying and resurrecting God, the wise old man in civilizations that were separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years and had no contact with each other? His answer was that these stories were not being invented, they were being discovered. They were the natural, spontaneous expressions of the fundamental, archetypal structures that already existed in the collective unconscious of the human race. He saw it in the dreams and fantasies of his modern, rational patients. He found that their dreams were often filled with the same strange, mythological symbols that he had read about in ancient, obscure texts. A 20th-century Swiss businessman might dream of a figure that was identical to an ancient Egyptian god he had never consciously heard of. For Jung, this was proof that the psyche was not just a product of our own short individual lives. It was a living museum, containing the entire spiritual and psychological history of our species. The biographical agony that fueled this discovery was his own. After his break with Freud, Jung entered a period of profound psychological crisis. He felt that his own conscious ego was being overwhelmed by powerful, autonomous, and often terrifying forces from his own depths. His famous Red Book is the private, secret journal of this period. It is the record of his own heroic and dangerous journey into this collective territory. He didn't just deduce the existence of the collective unconscious, he experienced it. He met its strange and powerful figures in his own visions. He had to map this world to save his own sanity. This is the profound and unsettling truth at the heart of Jung's map of the soul. He teaches us that the most ancient, most universal, and most powerful part of your psyche is the part you did not create. To truly know yourself, you must go on a journey beyond yourself. The path to discovering your own unique, individual identity leads directly through the shared, timeless, and collective inheritance of the entire human race. This discovery of the collective unconscious, this shared psychic inheritance of the human race, is the foundation of Jung's entire system. It is the vast, ancient ocean in which our small individual islands of consciousness float. But what, exactly, resides in this deep, universal mind? What are its structures? What are its inhabitants? The answer to this question is Jung's most famous, most influential, and perhaps most misunderstood concept. The answer is the archetypes. To understand the archetypes, it is helpful to use a biological analogy. Just as your physical body inherits a genetic blueprint, your DNA that determines its fundamental structure and instincts, Jung believed that your psyche also inherits a blueprint. The collective unconscious is this psychic DNA, and the archetypes are the specific genes within that code. It is crucial to understand what an archetype is not. It is not an inherited idea or a specific, concrete image. You are not born with a picture of a dragon in your head. Rather, an archetype is an inherited pattern. It is a primordial, pre-existing tendency to form certain representations. It is a psychic instinct that shapes how we experience, interpret, and respond to the world. Think of it like a dry riverbed. The riverbed itself is the archetype. It is the ancient, pre-existing channel, carved into the landscape of the psyche over millions of years of human experience. The specific water that flows through it, your own personal, cultural, and historical experiences, is what gives it its unique content. But the shape of the river, the path it follows, is universal. The archetypes are these riverbeds of the soul. They are the deep structures that organize our psychic life. How do we know they exist? Jung saw their fingerprints everywhere. He saw them in the great universal patterns of world mythology. Consider the archetype of the hero. Across thousands of cultures, separated by vast oceans and millennia of time, we find the same fundamental story. A hero is called to a great adventure. He must leave his ordinary world, face a series of trials, descend into a dark underworld, slay a dragon, or confront a great evil, and then return to his community with a boon, a treasure, a gift that renews his world. Why is this story so powerful? Why does it resonate with us so deeply, from ancient myths to modern Hollywood blockbusters? Jung's answer is that the hero's journey is not just an entertaining story. It is the symbolic map of the process of psychological development itself. It is the story of the ego's necessary journey of confronting the darkness of the unconscious and returning with the treasure of a more complete and integrated personality. We love the story because it is, on a deep unconscious level, our own. Or consider the archetype of the Great Mother. This is the primordial image of the source of all life. She has a benevolent side. She is Mother Earth, the nurturing, life-giving force that sustains us. She is the Virgin Mary, the symbol of unconditional love and compassion. But every archetype has a dual nature, a light side and a dark side. The Great Mother also has a terrifying destructive aspect. She is the devouring mother who refuses to let her children grow. She is the witch in the gingerbread house who lures you in with sweetness in order to consume you. She is the dragon of chaos. We also see the archetype of the wise old man, the figure who represents meaning and spiritual guidance. He is Merlin, Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the mentor who appears when the hero is lost and offers a crucial piece of wisdom or a magical tool. And there is his opposite, the trickster. The figure of chaos, of disruption, of humor that breaks taboos. He is the court jester who speaks truth to the king. He is Loki in Norse mythology, Coyote in Native American tale. The trickster shatters our rigid certainties and through his chaos opens the door for new creation. The biographical agony that gave Jung the authority to speak of these things was his own direct and terrifying encounter with them. During his confrontation with the unconscious, after his break with Freud, these were not just intellectual concepts for him. They became living, autonomous realities within his own psyche. He documented in his Red Book how he had to learn to converse with these figures from his own depths. He met a figure he came to call Philemon, an old man with wings who became his inner guru, a living embodiment of the wise old man archetype. He wrestled with his own dark side, his shadow. His experience was a terrifying confirmation that the psyche is not a single unified thing that we control. It is a polytheistic world, a stage inhabited by ancient gods and demons. These archetypal forces are real, and if we do not consciously engage with them, they will control us from the darkness. Beyond these great mythological figures, Jung identified a set of core archetypes that make up the fundamental structure of our own individual personalities. These are the figures we must all confront on our personal journey of individuation. There is the persona, our social mask, which we will explore next. There is the shadow, the dark brother or sister that lives in our unconscious. There is the anima, or animus, our inner, contrasexual soul image. And finally, there is the self, the central archetype of wholeness, the hidden king who rules the entire psychic kingdom. And so we are left with the great humbling truth of Jungian psychology. You are not a blank slate. Your mind is not entirely your own. It is an ancient house, and you are only the most recent resident. It is haunted by the ghosts of 1,000,000 ancestors and governed by gods and demons who have been worshipped and feared since the dawn of time. The most personal and intimate journey you can take, the journey into yourself, is not in the end a journey into the personal at all. It is a journey into the timeless, shared, and sacred drama of the entire human race. This journey into the collective unconscious, into the world of ancient gods and demons, can seem distant from our ordinary day-to-day lives. But Jung argued that these archetypal forces are not just confined to myths and dreams. They are at work all around us, and within us, shaping our every interaction. And the very first archetype we must confront, the one that governs our entire relationship with the social world, is the one we see in the mirror every morning. It is the face we show to others. He called it the persona. The word persona is the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient Roman theater. The mask signaled to the audience what role the actor was playing. The hero, the villain, the old man, the fool. It was their public face, their dramatic character. Jung chose this term with perfect precision. The persona is our social mask. It is our psychological clothing. It is the version of ourselves that we create to navigate the complexities of social life. It is a crucial and necessary part of being a functional human being. You have a persona for your professional life, the competent, efficient employee, or the authoritative, confident boss. You have a different persona for your family life, the dutiful son, loving mother, the supportive partner. You have another for your group of friends. These masks are not necessarily a lie. They are a curated and functional slice of our total personality adapted to a specific social situation. The persona is the interface between our private inner world, our ego, and the demands and expectations of the outer world. It allows for smooth social interactions. It protects our more vulnerable private self from unnecessary exposure. Having a healthy, flexible, and appropriate persona is a sign of good psychological adaptation. But Jung, in his work with his patients, discovered a profound and distinctly modern danger. The danger is not in having a persona. The danger is in being had by it. This is the great problem of identification with the persona. This happens when the ego, our conscious sense of self, completely merges with one of our social masks. We forget that the mask is just a role we are playing, and we come to believe that it is our true and total identity. The actor who plays the role of a king on stage and then goes home and continues to act like a king with his family is the classic example. He has identified with his persona. We see this everywhere in modern life. The CEO who cannot stop being a CEO, who treats his family like his employees. The doctor who cannot stop being a doctor, who sees everyone, including her own children, as a patient to be diagnosed. The politician who is never not a politician, whose every word and gesture is a calculated performance for an invisible audience. When this happens, the person is no longer a human being playing a role. They have become a role, playing at being a human being. The consequences of this are spiritually and psychologically devastating. When we identify with the persona, our life becomes shallow and inauthentic. We lose contact with our own genuine feelings, our own true thoughts, and our own deeper self. Our life becomes a performance, a constant effort to live up to the expectations of the role we have chosen. This often leads to a profound and inexplicable sense of emptiness. This was the central biographical agony that Jung encountered again and again in his clinical practice. He treated countless patients, particularly in the second half of life, who were, by all external measures, enormous successes. They were wealthy doctors, respected academics, powerful businessmen. They had built perfect personas. They had achieved everything that society told them they should want, and they were miserable. They came to him suffering from depression, anxiety, a crippling loss of meaning, a sense of being a fraud. Their agony was the emptiness of a life lived entirely on the surface. They had invested all of their psychic energy into building a perfect and successful mask, and in doing so, they had completely neglected the real person living underneath it. Their soul was starving to death. This over-identification with a role can also lead to a dangerous psychological condition that Jung called inflation. This is when the ego becomes inflated, puffed up with the power and prestige of a particular social role. The person starts to believe they are the great doctor, the brilliant artist, the infallible CEO. This leads to arrogance, a loss of humility, and a complete inability to handle criticism or failure. Because any attack on the persona is no longer seen as a critique of their work. It is perceived as a fundamental attack on their very being, because they have forgotten where the role ends and their true self begins. The great work of the individuation journey, especially in the second half of life, is the conscious and often painful process of differentiating the ego from the persona. It is the work of recognizing that you are not your job title. You are not your social status. You are not the collection of roles you play for your family and friends. These are just masks, necessary and useful masks, but masks nonetheless. The real work is to discover the face that lies beneath them. And so we come to the first great painful task of the Jungian journey. We spend the first half of our lives meticulously crafting a mask, a perfect and successful face to show the world. and we must spend the second half of our lives learning to take it off. The personality that brought you success in the world is the very thing that becomes the greatest obstacle to the salvation of your soul. To find your true self, you must first have the courage to destroy the successful self you have become. This courageous act of taking off the persona, of looking behind the successful mask we present to the world, is the first and most necessary step on the inward journey. But what do we find when we do this? What lies there in the darkness behind the carefully constructed facade of our respectable selves? Jung's answer is that we find our own rejected twin, our dark brother, the part of ourselves that we have spent our entire lives pretending does not exist. We find the archetype of the shadow. If the persona is the face we show to the world, the shadow is everything we hide from it. It is the personal unconscious. It is the psychic bag that we all drag behind us, and into it we stuff every aspect of our personality that we consider to be inferior, shameful, or simply inconvenient. It is our repressed anger, our secret greed, our unacceptable desires, our cowardice, our selfishness, our primitive instincts. It is all the parts of ourselves that do not fit the neat, tidy, and admirable image of the person we would like to be. Everyone has a shadow. The more respectable and perfect the persona is on the surface, the larger and darker the shadow is likely to be in the depths. The existence of the shadow is not, in itself, a problem. The problem is that we are, for the most part, completely unconscious of it. We are experts at hiding it, not only from others, but from ourselves. And how do we achieve this feat of self-deception? We use one of the most powerful and dangerous of all psychological mechanisms, projection. Because we cannot bear to see the darkness in our own hearts. We project it outward. We see it everywhere, in everyone else. The man who is most violently homophobic is often wrestling with his own repressed sexuality. The person who is most self-righteously judgmental about the immorality of others is often hiding a secret, shadow life of their own. The politician who rails against corruption is often the most corrupt of all. This is the logic of the shadow. The things that irritate, infuriate, and disgust us most in other people are very often the disowned and unacknowledged parts of our own psyche. The people who trigger the most intense and irrational hatred in us are often just living out a part of our own nature that we have refused to accept. They are a mirror, showing us the very darkness we deny in ourselves. This is why witch hunts and moral panics are so common in human history. They are a collective form of shadow projection, where an entire society projects its own darkness onto a single scapegoat or a minority group, and then feels virtuous by destroying it. So what is the solution? The naive answer is to try and destroy the shadow, to repress it, to conquer it, to be a good person who has no darkness at all. For Jung, this is not just impossible, it is a catastrophic mistake. To try and destroy your own shadow is to declare war on a part of yourself. It is an act of psychic civil war that will only ever make you weaker, more neurotic, and more divided. A person with no shadow is not a whole person. They are a two-dimensional caricature, lacking depth and substance. The goal is not to destroy the shadow. The goal is to integrate it. This is what Jung called the apprentice piece of the individuation journey. It is the first, most difficult, and most essential task of anyone who is serious about becoming a conscious human being. Shadow integration is the courageous and painful process of withdrawing your projections. It is the act of looking at the people and the groups you despise and asking the terrifying question, what part of myself am I seeing in them? It requires a profound act of moral courage. It is the willingness to take responsibility for the totality of who you are, not just the polite, socially acceptable parts. It is the act of admitting, yes, I too have the capacity for that same greed, that same cruelty, that same cowardice that I see and condemn in others. This was not a theoretical exercise for Jung. This was the central biographical agony of his own inner journey. After his break with Freud, when he descended into his own unconscious, he had to confront his own shadow. He had to acknowledge his own lust for power, his own intellectual pride, his own capacity for darkness. His Red Book is, in many ways, the journal of this brutal confrontation. He understood that he was not just the wise and benevolent Dr. Jung, the persona the world saw. He was also a man who contained primitive, archaic, and sometimes dangerous forces. His lifelong work was the struggle to hold the tension between these two sides of his nature. to be both a civilized man and a whole man. But this difficult work yields an incredible reward. Because the shadow is not just a container for our weaknesses and our vices. This is a crucial Jungian insight. It also contains our gold. The shadow is the repository for everything that we had to repress in order to fit into our family, our culture, and our society. This often includes not just negative traits, but also our positive, life-affirming potentials. It might be our creativity, our authentic passions, our righteous anger, our connection to our bodies and our instincts. Anything that was deemed too messy, too unconventional, or too unrespectable for our polite persona. To integrate the shadow, therefore, is not just about becoming more honest about your darkness. It is about reclaiming the lost and buried parts of your own vitality. To find the gold, you must first be willing to face the dragon that guards it. This is the great humbling and dangerous work of the soul. Jung teaches us that you cannot become a good person by simply trying to be good. You can only become a good person by courageously confronting your own capacity for evil. The path to the light is not a flight from the darkness. It leads directly through its heart. To find the God within you, you must first be willing to shake hands with the devil. This courageous confrontation with the shadow, this integration of our own darkness, is the first great and necessary act of the inward journey. It is the apprentice piece of a lifetime's work, but once we have descended into that darkness, we do not find ourselves alone. Jung discovered that in the depths of the psyche, waiting for us behind the shadow, is another powerful and mysterious archetypal figure. It is our own inner opposite, our contrasexual soul image, the part of our psyche that contains the gender identity we have not consciously lived. For a man, this figure is the anima. For a woman, it is the anima. To understand this is to move into the more subtle and complex layers of Jungian thought. This is not about modern social gender roles, and it is certainly not about simple stereotypes. Jung was talking about deep archetypal principles of psychic energy. He associated the masculine principle, the animus, with the Greek concept of logos, the energy of reason, of structure, of discrimination, of assertive action in the world. He associated the feminine principle, the anima, with the concept of eros, the energy of feeling, of connection, of relatedness, of the creative and often chaotic flow of life itself. Every person, he argued, contains both of these principles, but our conscious ego identity typically aligns with our biological sex, and the other, contrasexual principle, is therefore relegated to the unconscious. It becomes the hidden other within us. And just like the shadow, our first encounter with this powerful inner figure is almost always through the mechanism of projection. This is Jung's profound and revolutionary theory of romantic love. The experience of falling in love, that sudden, magical, and often overwhelmingly powerful feeling of finding your soulmate, is, from a Jungian perspective, an archetypal event. What is happening, he argued, is that we are projecting our own unconscious, undeveloped anima or animus onto a real person in the outer world. The man projects his inner soul image, his anima, onto a real woman. The woman projects her inner soul image, her animus, onto a real man. This is what creates the sense of magic and predestined connection. We are not just falling in love with the actual person. We are falling in love with a forgotten and divine part of our own soul, which we have suddenly and miraculously discovered walking around in the world. This explains the intoxicating and often delusional nature of infatuation. We are not seeing the real, flawed human being in front of us. We are seeing a god or a goddess, the perfect carrier of our own projected soul. Jung believed that this inner figure was not static, but that it develops in stages as we mature. The anima for a man might first appear as Eve, a figure of purely biological, instinctual, and earthly connection. Then she might evolve into Helen of Troy, a figure of aesthetic beauty and romantic desire. At a higher stage, she becomes the Virgin Mary, a symbol of spiritualized love and devotion. And at her highest form, she becomes Sophia, the embodiment of divine wisdom itself. The animus, for a woman, might first appear as a figure of pure physical power, a Tarzan. Then he might evolve into a romantic man of action, like a Lord Byron. Then he becomes a man of words and authority, like a great orator or statesman. And at his highest form, he becomes Hermes, the messenger of the gods, a guide to spiritual meaning. These stages represent a growing maturity in our relationship with this inner figure. The great and difficult work of the individuation journey is to gradually withdraw these projections. This is often a painful and disillusioning process. It usually happens when the real person inevitably fails to live up to the divine image we have projected onto them. The relationship either ends, or it is forced to transform from a magical projection into a real relationship between two flawed human beings. The goal is not to stop loving the outer person. The goal is to stop burdening them with the impossible task of being our soul. The work is to take back the projection and begin to build a conscious internal relationship with the anima or animus. For a man, integrating his anima means connecting with his own capacity for feeling, for relatedness, for intuition, and for creativity. The anima is his bridge to the unconscious, the guide who can help him navigate his own inner world. An unintegrated anima can leave a man moody, emotionally irrational, and disconnected from his own inner life. For a woman, integrating her animus means connecting with her own capacity for reason, for focused thought, for assertive action, and for independent spiritual judgment. The animus is the part of her that allows her to build and create in the outer world with authority and purpose. An unintegrated animus can leave a woman possessed by rigid, argumentative opinions and a critical, judgmental nature. This was not an abstract theory for Jung. This was the landscape of his own biographical agony, his own intense and often complicated relationships with women, particularly with his patient-turned-colleague Sabina Spielrein, and his longtime companion Tony Wolff, were a central part of his life's work. He saw these relationships not just as personal affairs, but as a living laboratory for understanding the powerful and dangerous dynamics of anima projection and integration. In his Red Book, his own anima appears as a figure named Salome, with whom he has a series of profound and difficult dialogues. He had to live through the fire of these relationships to be able to map them. This is the great paradoxical secret that Jung reveals about the nature of love and the soul. The person we fall most desperately in love with in the outer world is often just a mirror, showing us a beautiful and terrifying stranger who lives inside of us. The great quest is not to possess the person in the mirror, but to turn inward and begin a relationship with the stranger in our own heart. True love for another is not possible until you have first learned to love the forgotten and rejected part of your own soul. This difficult, courageous work of integrating the persona, the shadow, and the anima, or animus, is not just a series of disconnected psychological exercises. It is a journey with a destination. As we begin to gather these lost, rejected, and projected parts of our own soul, we start to sense the presence of a deeper, central organizing principle within the psyche. It is the destination that was, in fact, the origin of the journey all along. This is the ultimate goal of the individuation process. It is the archetype of all archetypes. It is the image of God within the human soul. Jung called it the self. To understand the self, we must begin with a crucial distinction. The self is not the ego. This is the single most important clarification in all of Jungian psychology. The ego is the center of our conscious awareness. It is the I that we think we are. For most of our lives, the ego operates under the illusion that it is the center of the universe, the master of our psychic house. But the self is the center of the entire psyche, both the conscious and the vast, powerful unconscious. If the ego is the earth, believing that all the planets and stars revolve around it, then the self is the sun. The great and often painful journey of psychological maturation is the Copernican revolution of the soul, where the ego realizes that it is not the center of everything, but is in fact just a small planet in orbit around a much larger, more powerful, and life-giving star. The self is the archetype of wholeness, of totality. It is the organizing principle that holds all the warring opposites of our nature in a state of dynamic, creative tension. It contains our conscious and our unconscious mind. It holds our persona and our shadow. It unites our inner masculine and feminine, our anima and animus. It is the part of us that is both human and divine. The self is our potential, our blueprint for the complete and whole person we were always meant to become. Jung saw the symbols of this universal archetype scattered throughout the myths, religions, and art of all human cultures. He saw it as the ultimate object of all spiritual seeking. The most common and powerful symbol of the self, he found, was the mandala. The word mandala is Sanskrit for sacred circle. These intricate circular designs are found everywhere, from Tibetan sand paintings and Hindu yantras to the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals and the healing sand paintings of Native American traditions. Jung discovered that his own modern, secular patients would spontaneously begin to draw or dream of these circular images during times of intense psychological crisis and transformation. The symbolism, he argued, is universal. The circle itself represents the wholeness and the protective boundary of the self. The center of the circle represents the divine point of origin and return, the eternal nucleus of the soul. To create a mandala is a subconscious attempt to recenter oneself, to find order in the midst of chaos. It is the psyche's own instinctive attempt to heal itself by creating an image of its own wholeness. But the most developed and psychologically sophisticated symbol of the self in the West, Jung argued, was the figure of Christ. In our last series, we explored this from many angles. For Jung, the story of Christ is a perfect, archetypal representation of the journey of the self. His dual nature, born of a human mother and a divine father, is a symbol of the self's union of the earthly and the transcendent. His life of suffering and his embrace of the outcasts is a symbol of the necessary integration of the shadow. The crucifixion, on the cross, is the ultimate symbol of the agonizing union of the opposites. And the resurrection is the symbol of the rebirth of the personality into a new, higher state of wholeness. However, as we have noted, Jung in his later life came to believe that the traditional image of Christ as a figure of pure goodness was an incomplete symbol of the self. To be truly whole, the self must contain not just the light, but the darkness as well. It must unite both Christ and his opposite, the Antichrist. The self is the totality of our nature, the beautiful and the terrible, the good and the evil. This was not an abstract idea for Jung. The biographical agony that underpins his entire theory was his own direct, numinous, and often terrifying experience of the self as an objective, transpersonal power. During his confrontation with the unconscious, the journey he documented in his Red Book, he did not just theorize about the self, he felt it. He experienced it as a divine, autonomous force that was operating through him, a force that was far greater and far wiser than his own small, frightened ego. His entire journey was the story of his ego learning to surrender its illusion of control and to enter into a proper relationship with this greater, central reality. It was an experience that both healed him and nearly drove him to the brink of madness. He learned that the goal of life was not for the ego to become stronger and conquer the unconscious. The goal of life was for the ego to become a conscious and willing servant to the self. This, for Jung, is the ultimate purpose of our existence. It is not to achieve wealth or fame or even what we typically think of as happiness. The ultimate goal is individuation, the lifelong process of realizing and embodying the archetype of the self. It is to become the unique, whole, and complete individual. That is our innate potential. This is the ultimate, paradoxical destination of the Jungian journey. The great work of becoming an individual is not an act of egoic self-assertion, it is an act of profound surrender to a force that is greater than the ego. You do not find yourself by looking for it. You find it when you have exhausted all your own efforts and finally allow it to find you. The final goal is not to become the master of your own soul, but to become a conscious and willing servant to the God that was living there all along. This vision of the self as the true center of the psyche, this archetype of wholeness that contains all our inner opposites, is the destination. But what is the journey? What is the long, difficult, and often dangerous path that a person must walk to move from the limited reality of the ego to the total reality of the self? Jung gave this process a name. It is the central, practical, and lifelong project of his entire psychology. He called it individuation. To understand this concept is to understand the ultimate goal of a Jungian life. The word itself gives us a clue. To individuate is to become an individual, which at its root means to become undivided. It is the process of becoming a psychologically whole and integrated human being. It is the journey of healing the splits in our own nature, of bringing the conscious and the unconscious parts of our psyche into a harmonious relationship. It is the process by which we realize and become the person we were always potentially meant to be. Now, it is crucial to distinguish individuation from its modern, often shallow cousin, individualism. Individualism is an act of the ego. It is about asserting your separateness from the crowd, about cultivating your own unique personality, about being a rugged individual. Individuation is almost the opposite. While it does lead to the discovery of one's unique self, it is not a journey away from humanity, but a journey deeper into it. It is the process by which the ego learns that it is not separate, but is, in fact, deeply connected to the entire collective unconscious, the shared psychic inheritance of the human race. The individualist wants to be special. The individuating person wants to be whole. For Jung, individuation is a natural process. It is like the teleological drive within an acorn to become an oak tree. The blueprint for the oak is already contained within the acorn. Given the right conditions, soil, water, sunlight, it will naturally grow into its own unique and complete form. In the same way, he believed, the blueprint for our own wholeness, the archetype of the self, is present within us from birth. There is an instinctual drive in the psyche to move towards integration and completeness. But unlike an acorn, human beings have an ego. Our conscious mind, with its fears, its ambitions, its desire for control, and its deep conditioning by family and society, can interfere with this natural process. We can build a persona that is too rigid. We can refuse to confront our shadow. We can remain trapped in our projections of the anima or animus. Therefore, individuation is not an automatic process. It is a collaboration. It is a conscious and often very difficult work undertaken by the ego to remove the obstacles that stand in the way of this natural inward growth. The goal of this work is not perfection. This is another critical distinction. To strive for perfection is to try and eliminate the bad parts of ourselves. It is an act of repression. It is an attempt to live entirely in the light, to identify with our admirable persona and to deny, repress, and project our shadow. To strive for wholeness, however, is the opposite. It is the courageous and difficult work of integrating all parts of ourselves, the light and the dark, the good and the bad, the noble and the shameful. It is the acceptance of our own complete, paradoxical, and often contradictory humanity. As Jung famously said, "I would rather be whole than good." This was not a theoretical idea for him. This was the story of his own life. The biographical agony that gave him the authority to speak of this process was his own terrifying, involuntary, and ultimately life-saving individuation journey. After his break with Freud, his entire professional and personal identity collapsed. The persona of Freud's heir was destroyed. He was cast out into a psychological wilderness, and in that void, the powerful, autonomous forces of the collective unconscious began to erupt into his conscious mind. This period, which he called his confrontation with the unconscious, was a descent into a kind of madness. It was his own personal journey into hell. He had to learn to navigate a world of powerful inner figures, of terrifying visions and profound revelations. His entire life's work was born from this ordeal. He had to individuate to survive. He had to find a new, deeper center for his personality, a center that was not his ego, but the self. He had to learn to differentiate himself from the powerful archetypal forces that threatened to overwhelm him, while also building a conscious and respectful relationship with them. In this process, he learned that the self is not just the destination of the journey, it is also the guide. The self, he believed, communicates with the ego. It sends us messages from the unconscious. It speaks to us in the symbolic language of dreams, in the strange, meaningful coincidences he called synchronicity, and in the powerful emotions that erupt from our complexes. The work of individuation is the work of learning to listen. It is the art of paying attention to these signals from the deep, of taking our inner lives seriously, and of trusting the wisdom of the psyche, even when it leads us into dark and frightening places. This is the great paradoxical work of a human life as Jung saw it. The journey to become a truly unique individual is not a journey away from humanity, but a journey into the very heart of it. You discover what is uniquely you by first discovering what is universally human. The path to becoming one, undivided whole, is not to eliminate your inner conflicts, but to learn how to hold them in a courageous and loving embrace. This great journey of individuation, this quest to become a whole and undivided self, is not a process that happens all at once, nor does it look the same at every stage of our existence. Jung saw that this journey follows a natural archetypal pattern, a pattern he compared to the daily journey of the sun. It rises in the morning, climbs to its zenith at midday, and then begins its long, slow descent towards the sunset, its light changing in quality as it moves. To understand this journey, we must first understand its beginning. We must explore the necessary, difficult, and often painful work of the first half of life. The psychological task of the period from our birth until roughly the age of 35 or 40 is a single, all-consuming project: adaptation to the outer world. We begin our lives in a state that Jung described as one of psychic unity with the mother, a state of unconscious wholeness. The infant does not yet have a separate sense of I. It exists in a kind of paradise, a world without division, a world of pure participation in its environment. The first great and often traumatic task of life is the birth of the ego. This is the slow, painful process of separation, of drawing a line in the psychic sand between me and not me. It is the necessary expulsion from the Garden of Eden of early childhood. We must leave the paradise of unconscious wholeness to begin the difficult work of building a conscious personality. The primary goal of these early decades is to build a strong, effective, and resilient ego. The ego is the captain of our conscious ship. It must learn to navigate the often stormy seas of reality. It must learn to deal with the demands of parents, of teachers, of society. It must learn the rules of the game. A major part of this project, as we have discussed, is the construction of a functional persona. We must learn how to be a student, how to be a friend, how to be a citizen, and eventually how to be an employee or a professional. We find a role in the great drama of society, and we learn to play that part well. The great project of the first half of life is to find a foothold in the external world. We build a career. We may find a partner and build a family. We establish a home. We create a stable, secure container for our life in the outer world. According to Jung, this is not just a personal choice, it is a biological and social necessity. A person who fails at these tasks, who enters midlife with a weak ego and no stable place in the world, is ill-prepared for the much more difficult journey that is to come. But this process of outer adaptation, while absolutely essential, always comes at a price. And the price is our own wholeness. To succeed in the world, we must specialize. We are born with a vast range of potentials, but to build a career, we must choose one path, and in doing so, we must close the door on 100 other possible lives. The man who becomes a lawyer must sacrifice the artist he might have been. The woman who becomes a scientist must sacrifice the adventurer she might have been. Even more profoundly, to create a socially acceptable persona, we must actively repress all the parts of our personality that do not fit that mask. We learn to hide our insecurities, to suppress our inappropriate emotions, to deny our dark impulses. This is the process by which we create and populate our shadow. The biographical agony of the first half of life is this necessary act of psychological self-mutilation. We must, in a sense, do violence to our own initial childlike wholeness in order to become a finite, focused, and effective adult. We trade the breadth of our potential for the depth of our reality. Jung's own life was a perfect and dramatic example of this process. He was a brilliant and immensely successful man in the first half of his life. He was a model student. He rose quickly to become a world-renowned psychiatrist at the prestigious Berg-Hölzli Clinic. He married, had a large family, and built a prosperous private practice. And, most importantly, he became the chosen son and anointed heir of the great Sigmund Freud. He built a powerful and almost perfect persona, Dr. Jung, the brilliant and successful psychoanalyst. He achieved everything the first half of life demanded of him, and he did so with an astonishing degree of excellence. And, as we know, it led him directly to the brink of a complete psychological collapse. Because in his relentless and successful drive to adapt to the outer world, his inner world, his own soul, had been dangerously neglected. This is the inherent one-sidedness of the first half of life. It is a period of looking outward. Its successes are measured by the standards of the collective, career advancement, social status, material security. And if we are successful in this, we often arrive at midlife with a strange and unsettling feeling. We have achieved everything we thought we wanted. We have won the game we set out to play, and we feel empty. The goals that drove us for the first 20 years of our adult lives suddenly lose their energy. A sense of meaninglessness, of, is this all there is, begins to creep in. This is not a sign that you have failed. For Jung, it is the sign that you have succeeded. It is the signal that the great project of the first half of life is now complete. The sun has reached its zenith, and it is now time for the second journey, the journey of the afternoon of life, to begin. This is the great, tragic, and necessary bargain of the first half of life. To build a life, you must first do violence to your own wholeness. You must sacrifice the infinite possibilities of your childhood self to become a finite and effective adult. The very persona that allows you to succeed in the world becomes a prison for your soul. And the summit of worldly achievement, Jung discovered, is often just a high and lonely plateau from which you can finally see the vast, unexplored desert of your own inner world. This high, lonely plateau, this summit of worldly achievement from which you can suddenly see the vast, unexplored desert of your own inner world, this is the landscape of midlife. And it is here, often in our late 30s or early 40s, that many people experience a profound and terrifying disorientation. A psychological earthquake that shakes the very foundations of their identity, their values, and their purpose. We have a name for it. We call it the midlife crisis. In our modern culture, we tend to see the midlife crisis as a pathetic cliché. It is a sign of failure, of desperation. It is the man who suddenly abandons his family and buys a red sports car. It is the woman who feels invisible and desperately tries to reclaim her lost youth. But for Jung, the midlife crisis was not a failure. It was the opposite. It was a sign that you had successfully completed the tasks of the first half of life. And it was a natural, necessary, and profoundly spiritual summons to begin the work of the second half. It is not a breakdown, it is a breakthrough, waiting to happen. The symptoms are familiar. A successful professional who has reached the top of their field suddenly feels that their work is meaningless. A devoted parent whose children are now growing up and leaving home feels a terrifying sense of emptiness and a loss of identity. A person who has achieved everything they set out to achieve, the marriage, the house, the career, wakes up one morning with the agonizing question, is this all there is? This feeling of depression, of meaninglessness, of being stuck in a life that no longer fits, is not the problem, according to Jung. It is the symptom. It is the language of the soul. It is a message being sent from the deep, neglected parts of the unconscious. The message is this: the way you have been living, the values that have guided you, the goals that have driven you for the first half of your life, are no longer sufficient. The ego's agenda has been exhausted. A new and greater agenda is now demanding to be heard. The midlife crisis is a summons from the self. To understand this, we must think of life in two great movements. The first half of life, as we have discussed, is about expansion into the outer world, building an ego, creating a persona, establishing a place in society. The second half of life is about a journey in the opposite direction. It is a journey of contraction, a turn inward, a journey into the depths of our own soul to find the meaning, the wholeness, and the wisdom that the outer world can never provide. The biographical agony of the midlife crisis is the pain of this turning point. It is a necessary death. The king who has ruled the first half of your life, your ambitious, world-conquering ego, must now die. He must learn to surrender his throne to a deeper, wiser authority. The values that served you so well in the morning of life, ambition, competition, adaptation, now become the very obstacles to your growth in the afternoon. To continue to live by the program of the first half of life in the second half is, for Jung, a psychological catastrophe. It is to become a rigid, bitter, and neurotic caricature of your younger self, a person who is incapable of genuine wisdom or maturity. Jung's own life was the ultimate testament to this process. His own midlife crisis was not a quiet discomfort, it was a complete and terrifying collapse. The trigger was his break with Freud, around the age of 38. This event was not just a professional disagreement, it was the death of his entire world. His powerful and successful persona, Dr. Jung, the brilliant psychiatrist, the chosen heir of psychoanalysis, was annihilated. He was cast out, professionally isolated, and plunged into a state of profound disorientation. He had reached the summit of his career, and he found that it was a barren peak. He wrote that he felt utterly lost, as if he had no ground under his feet. This collapse was the beginning of his confrontation with the unconscious. It was his own midlife crisis, in its most extreme and dramatic form. He had to let the old king die. He had to surrender his heroic, ambitious ego and embark on a dangerous journey into his own inner world to find a new source of meaning. He had to live this crisis in its full, agonizing depth to be able to map it for the rest of us. He saw this pattern reflected in the great myths of humanity. The midlife crisis is what the mythologist Joseph Campbell, a student of Jung's work, would call the call to adventure. The hero is living in their ordinary, comfortable, successful world. And then a call comes, a summons to leave that world behind and embark on a perilous journey into the unknown. The journey is always inward. The dragons to be slain, the treasures to be found, are not in the outer world, but in the depths of our own psyche. The treasure is the recovery of the lost and forgotten parts of ourselves, our shadow, our anima or animus. The ultimate goal is the discovery of the self. But the hero can always refuse the call. A person can refuse the summons of the midlife crisis. They can double down on the values of the first half of life. They can try to silence the soul's yearning with more work, more money, more distractions. They can cling to their youthful persona, refusing to age, refusing to change, refusing to grow. This, Jung warns, is the path to a life of quiet desperation, a life that becomes increasingly hollow, rigid, and meaningless as the years pass. The midlife crisis is not a problem to be solved so that you can go back to your old life. The old life is over. The crisis is a doorway. It is an invitation to begin the most important and most rewarding journey of your existence. This is the profound and often brutal wisdom of the midday of life. Jung teaches us that the greatest crisis a person can face is not failure, but a success that has become empty. The soul does not begin to awaken when your life is going well, but when the life you have so carefully built begins to fall apart. The midlife crisis is not the end of your story. It is the agonizing, necessary, and ultimately grace-filled death of the hero you thought you were, so that the person you were always meant to be can finally be born. This death of the old, ego-driven self, this agonizing breakdown of the life you thought you had during the midlife crisis, is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the necessary clearing of the ground for the great and sacred work of the second half of life. Jung saw the human lifespan as an archetypal journey, like the daily passage of the sun across the sky. The first half of life, the morning, is about ascending. It is about gaining strength, shining brightly, and casting our light as far as we can into the outer world. Its goal is to climb to the zenith, to the midday point of worldly success and adaptation. But after midday, the sun does not try to keep climbing. It begins its descent. Its purpose is no longer to shine with the bright, direct light of noon, but with the softer, more reflective, and more golden light of the afternoon. It is a conscious turning towards the sunset. The second half of life, Jung argued, requires this same fundamental shift in direction. The great project is no longer expansion into the world, but a deep exploration of the soul. The questions change. The question of the first half is, what does the world demand of me, and how can I succeed in it? The question of the second half is, what does my soul demand of me, and what is the meaning of my unique, individual life? This is the great inward turn. The primary task of this new chapter is to consciously and deliberately dismantle the very structures that we worked so hard to build in the first half. We must begin the slow and often painful work of differentiating from the persona, the social mask. The successful role that was so necessary for our early achievements must now be recognized for what it is, a mask. It is a functional but limited part of our total personality, not the whole of it. The armor that was necessary for the battles of the morning of life has now become a heavy, constricting prison in the afternoon. The second half of life is about learning to take it off. This leads to the central project of this stage, a conscious and sustained engagement with the unconscious. The parts of ourselves that we had to repress and deny in order to succeed in the first half. Our shadow, our anima or animus, now demand to be heard. They are no longer problems to be managed, but mysteries to be explored. The work is to turn and face them. It is the work of shadow integration, of taking responsibility for our own darkness. It is the work of withdrawing our projections, of taking back our soul image from the people we have projected it onto, and building an inner relationship with our own masculine or feminine core. It is the work of listening to the forgotten language of our dreams, of seeing them not as random noise, but as letters from the self guiding us on this inward journey. This requires a fundamental shift in the psychic power structure. The ego, which for the first half of life was the proud and confident king of our conscious world, must now learn a new and difficult virtue, humility. It must learn to cede its position as the center of the psyche. It must come to understand that it is not the master of the house, but a servant to a deeper, wiser, and greater authority. The goal is for the ego to enter into a conscious relationship with the self, to become the viceroy who rules on behalf of the true, hidden king. This inward turn is also a search for a new source of meaning. The collective values of our culture, success, wealth, status, which were so motivating in our youth, often feel hollow and unfulfilling in the second half. The task now is to discover a personal myth, a private and unique sense of purpose that is not dictated by the outside world, but which arises from the depths of our own soul. For some, this may take the form of a renewed engagement with a religious tradition. For others, it may be a commitment to creative work, to mentoring the next generation, or to a deep exploration of nature. The specific form does not matter. What matters is that it is a meaning that is authentic, personal, and provides a connection to a reality that is larger than the individual ego. This was the path that Jung himself walked. His biographical agony, his midlife crisis, was the catalyst. After that profound and terrifying confrontation with the unconscious, the second half of his life was a living embodiment of this inward turn. He largely withdrew from the political battles of the psychoanalytic world. He was no longer interested in building a movement or cementing his public persona. His great work took place in the solitude of his study and at his rustic, hand-built stone tower at Bollingen. This tower was his monastery, his alchemical laboratory. It was the place where he did his own inner work. He spent his days not treating wealthy patients, but studying ancient and obscure alchemical texts, carving mandalas into stone, and continuing the difficult dialogue with his own unconscious that he had begun in the Red Book. This was his second half of life project. He was no longer trying to build a successful career. He was trying to understand the human soul. He had to live this inward journey himself, in its most profound and dedicated form, to be able to map it for the rest of us. Finally, a central task of the second half of life is the conscious preparation for death. This is not a morbid or pessimistic preoccupation. For Jung, a life that has not come to terms with its own end cannot be a whole life. He believed that the person who has successfully individuated, who has shifted the center of their personality from the mortal ego to the timeless self, can approach death in a new way. It is no longer seen as a terrifying annihilation of the self, but as a final and meaningful transition, a return to the great psychic ocean from which we all emerged. This is the great, inverted logic of a well-lived life. According to Jung, the first half is a heroic ascent, a climbing of the mountain of worldly achievement. The second half is a courageous descent into the valley of the soul. You must become smaller in order to become larger. You must surrender the power of the ego to find the strength of the self. And the ultimate purpose of life is not to build a lasting monument in the world, but to become a fitting vessel for the timeless and eternal self that was waiting within you all along. This great inward turn of the second half of life, this journey into the vast and unknown territory of the soul. How does one navigate it? How does one find their way in that strange, symbolic, and often disorienting landscape? Jung's answer was that we do not have to journey alone. Every night, he believed, a guide speaks to us from the depths of our own being. It is a voice that is wiser, older, and more complete than our own conscious ego. This is the forgotten and most important language of the soul, the language of dreams. In the early 20th century, the world of psychology was dominated by Sigmund Freud's revolutionary theory of dreams. For Freud, the dream was primarily a mechanism of disguise and wish fulfillment. He believed the dream was a kind of coded letter from the unconscious, a secret message that hid our repressed and mostly infantile and sexual desires. The bizarre and nonsensical surface of the dream, he argued, was a deliberate censorship, designed to hide its true, often shocking, latent content. The dream was a liar. Jung, after years of analyzing thousands of dreams, came to a radically different and more profound conclusion. He argued that the dream is not trying to hide things from us. It is desperately trying to show us things. It is a natural, spontaneous, and brutally honest expression of our total psychic reality. The dream is not a liar, it is the most honest friend we will ever have. It is a direct communication from the self. The central function of the dream, Jung discovered, is compensation. The psyche, like the physical body, is a self-regulating system that is always seeking balance, or homeostasis. The dream is the primary mechanism through which the psyche tries to correct the imbalances and the one-sidedness of our conscious attitude. If our conscious life has become too rational, too intellectual, too detached, our dreams will often be filled with wild, passionate, and chaotic emotional energy. This is the unconscious compensating for our conscious dryness, reminding us of the feeling part of ourselves we have neglected. If our conscious persona is that of a kind, gentle, and altruistic person, our dreams may be haunted by a dark, aggressive, and selfish figure. Our shadow. The dream is not accusing us, it is reminding us of the other, repressed half of our own nature, urging us toward wholeness. The successful, powerful CEO who has built his entire life on ambition and control might have a recurring dream of being a lost, naked child in a strange city. This is the unconscious compensating for his inflated ego, reminding him of his own vulnerability and his lost, authentic self. The dream is a diagnostic tool of unparalleled precision. It shows us where we have gone wrong. It reveals the parts of ourselves we have abandoned. It is the soul's own attempt to heal its own division. This led Jung to a completely different method of interpretation. Freud's primary method was free association, where the dreamer would follow a chain of personal associative links from a dream image to uncover its repressed, personal meaning. Jung found this to be too limited. He developed a method called amplification. Amplification is the process of taking a central dream image, a snake, a tree, a cup, a key, and looking for its meaning, not just in the dreamer's personal life, but in the universal stories of humanity. What has this symbol meant in the myths, the fairy tales, the religions, and the alchemical texts of cultures all over the world? When a modern person dreams of being swallowed by a great fish, Jung would not just ask about their personal associations, he would amplify the image by looking at the story of Jonah and the whale and other myths of the hero's night sea journey. This is because he believed that dreams speak in a universal, archetypal language. They are a communication not just from our personal unconscious, but from the deep, ancient, and collective unconscious. To amplify a dream is to connect our small personal story to the great, timeless, and universal human story. The biographical agony that fueled Jung's entire approach to dreams was his own. After his break with Freud, he was not just an objective analyst of this process. He was its subject. He was plunged into a world where his own dreams and visions became overwhelmingly powerful and vivid. He had no choice but to take them seriously. His own sanity depended on learning to understand their strange, symbolic language. His famous Red Book is the record of this process. It is a journal of his waking dialogues with the figures from his own dreams and visions. He learned that these were not just random fragments of his own mind, they were autonomous, intelligent, and powerful parts of his psyche. He did not just analyze his dreams, he conversed with them. He painted them. He entered into them through a process he called active imagination. He had to learn to be a humble student of his own soul. His entire therapeutic method was born from this desperate personal need to understand the messages that were erupting from his own depths. Dreams, he concluded, are our guides on the path of individuation. They show us the state of our persona. They introduce us to our shadow. They present us with images of our anima or animus. And in moments of great significance, they provide us with unifying symbols of the self, like the mandala, pointing us toward the ultimate goal of wholeness. The dream is the voice of the self, the call from the center of our being, constantly urging the lost and wandering ego to find its way home. This is Jung's revolutionary re-enchantment of the inner world. He teaches us that the most nonsensical and irrational part of our lives is in fact the most profoundly meaningful. The path to our highest reason is not found in the clear light of conscious thought, but in the strange, symbolic, and often terrifying language of our nightly madness. To become truly awake, he insists, You must first learn to listen to what speaks to you only when you are asleep. This deep, inner world of dreams and archetypes is a reality that exists within all of us. But Jung, in his decades of work as a clinician, made a crucial observation. He saw that people have a fundamentally different and often opposite orientation to this inner reality versus the outer world of people and things. This observation led him to develop his most famous, his most widely influential, and his most frequently misunderstood contribution to psychology, the theory of psychological types. This is the work that would give our modern world its most common psychological vocabulary. It is the source of the concepts of the introvert and the extrovert. To begin, we must understand what Jung meant by these terms. For him, they were not descriptions of social behavior, like being shy or being outgoing. They were descriptions of the fundamental direction of the flow of psychic energy, or libido. The first attitude he identified was extraversion. For the extravert, psychic energy flows naturally outwards, towards the external object. The outer world of people, of things, of activities, of sensory experience. This is the world that feels most real, most important, and most energizing. The extravert's primary orientation is towards the objective reality outside of themselves. The second, opposite attitude he identified was introversion. For the introvert, psychic energy flows naturally inwards, towards the internal, subjective world. The inner world of ideas, of feelings, of images, of reflections. This is the world that feels most real, most significant, and most energizing. The introvert's primary orientation is towards their own subjective experience of reality. It is absolutely crucial that we discard the popular, simplistic stereotypes of these terms. This is not about being shy versus being the life of the party. An introvert can be a brilliant public speaker or a charming conversationalist. An extravert can enjoy a quiet evening with a book. These are not measures of social skill, they are measures of psychic energy. The fundamental difference is this: the extravert goes out into the world to recharge their batteries. The introvert goes into solitude to recharge their batteries. The extravert feels drained by too much time alone. The introvert feels drained by too much time with others. Where did this revolutionary theory come from? It was born from the deepest biographical agony of Jung's professional life. His attempt to understand the bitter and irreconcilable conflict between himself, his mentor Sigmund Freud, and their other great contemporary, Alfred Adler. Here were three of the most brilliant minds in Europe, all looking at the same human psyche, and all coming to completely different and mutually exclusive conclusions. Freud, he realized, was an extravert. His entire theory was based on the overwhelming importance of the external object. For Freud, the central drama of human life was our relationship with others. Our parents, our sexual partners, our neuroses were caused by repressed desires for an external object. Adler, with his theory of the will to power, was also, in his own way, an extravert. His focus was on the individual's struggle for significance and superiority within the social world. It was a psychology about adapting to and overcoming the external conditions of society. But Jung realized that his own deepest interest lay elsewhere. He was fundamentally oriented towards the inner, subjective world. He was fascinated by the archetypes, the myths, the dreams, the internal reality of the soul. He was, by his own definition, an introvert. The agonizing realization for Jung was that their years of bitter conflict were not about who was right and who was wrong. It was like a man who is naturally musical arguing with a man who is naturally visual about what the true nature of art is. They were not describing a single objective reality. They were each describing, with perfect accuracy, the world as seen from their own innate and unchangeable psychological standpoint. This realization was an act of profound intellectual humility. It was the birth of true psychological pluralism. He understood that a complete psychology must be able to account for these fundamental differences in human nature. No one, Jung insisted, is a pure introvert or a pure extravert. We all contain both attitudes within us. One is simply dominant and more conscious, while the other remains secondary and more unconscious. A healthy and well-rounded life requires us to develop both sides of our nature. A person must be able to effectively navigate both the demands of the outer world and the realities of their inner world. The great danger is one-sidedness. The extreme extrovert, who lives entirely for the outer world, becomes a shallow social chameleon. They are completely dependent on the validation and stimulation of others. They lose all contact with their own inner life, their own soul. They become hollow, a collection of social roles with no authentic center. The extreme introvert, on the other hand, who retreats completely from the outer world, becomes an isolated hermit. They can be overwhelmed by the subjective power of their own unconscious. They may have a rich inner life, but they are unable to bring its treasures into the real world. They become socially inept and ineffectual. The journey of individuation, therefore, requires a conscious effort to develop our inferior, less conscious attitude. The extrovert must learn the difficult art of solitude and introspection. The introvert must learn the difficult art of engaging with and acting in the world. This is the great humbling lesson at the heart of Jung's typology. He teaches us that our most fundamental way of seeing the world is both our greatest gift and our most profound limitation. Your type is the lens that gives your world its color, its focus, and its clarity. But it is also a lens that makes you partially blind to the colors and the realities that others see. True wisdom, then, is not found in proving that your own view is the correct one. It is found in the difficult and compassionate recognition that the world is far larger and stranger than your own innate psychology can ever allow you to perceive. This map of the psyche, with its attitudes and its functions, is a magnificent attempt to bring a rational, scientific order to the complexities of human personality. It is the work of Jung the clinician, the careful observer, the scientist. But there was another side to Jung. There was the mystic, the explorer of the irrational, the man who was convinced that the universe was governed by more than just the predictable and understandable laws of cause and effect. This led him to his most challenging, most controversial, and most mind-bending idea. A concept that takes us to the very edge of psychology and into the strange borderlands between the mind and matter, between the soul and the cosmos. He called this principle synchronicity. At its simplest, synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. It is the experience of two or more events which are connected not by a linear chain of cause and effect, but by a shared, underlying meaning. It is a coincidence that is so improbable and so subjectively meaningful to the person who experiences it that it feels like more than just a random accident. The first event is always an internal, psychic one, a thought, a dream, a vision, a powerful feeling. The second is an external physical event that mirrors the internal state in a way that defies all logical explanation. To understand this, we must turn to Jung's most famous case study of the phenomenon. He was treating a female patient who was, in his words, psychologically stuck. She was a woman of formidable intelligence, a brilliant rationalist, who believed she knew everything. Her perfect intellectual persona was a fortress that made any real therapeutic progress impossible. Jung knew that he would have to wait for something unexpected and irrational to happen that could break through her defenses. One day, she was telling him about a powerful dream she had the night before. In the dream, she had been given a piece of priceless jewelry in the shape of a golden scarab. The scarab beetle was a potent symbol of rebirth and transformation in ancient Egyptian mythology. As she was describing this image from her inner world, Jung heard a gentle tapping sound behind him, on the windowpane. He turned and saw a flying insect knocking against the glass from the outside. He opened the window, caught the insect as it flew in, and walked back to his patient. He held out his closed hand and said to her, "Here is your scarab." He opened his hand. In it was a Cetonia aurata, a common rose chafer beetle, whose golden-green coloring is the closest European equivalent to a golden scarab. The patient was stunned into silence. This moment of impossible, irrational coincidence shattered her rigid, rationalist persona. It was the breakthrough that allowed her therapeutic journey to truly begin. This is synchronicity. There was no conceivable causal link between the woman dreaming of a scarab and a real beetle appearing at the window at that exact moment. The two events were connected only by their shared, profound meaning for the person experiencing them. This was the biographical agony of Jung the scientist. His own life and the lives of his patients were filled with these kinds of meaningful coincidences. His scientific training demanded that he explain the world through causality, but his direct, lived experience showed him a world that was also filled with these strange, acausal, and meaningful patterns. He hesitated for over 20 years before publishing his work on synchronicity because he knew it would expose him to the ridicule of the scientific and academic communities. It was a profound professional risk, but he ultimately chose to be true to his own experience rather than confining himself to the limits of the dominant scientific model. He came to believe that causality was not the only organizing principle in the universe. Think of it this way. Causality is a horizontal principle. It connects events in a linear chain through time. A causes B, which then causes C. Synchronicity, he proposed, is a vertical principle. It is a moment when the inner, psychic world and the outer, physical world are momentarily aligned. It is a crack in the fabric of ordinary reality that gives us a glimpse of a deeper, underlying unity. He speculated about an unus mundus, a Latin term for one world. This is an ancient, alchemical idea of a unified reality that lies beneath the apparent division between mind and matter, between psyche and physis. In this unified reality, psyche and matter are not separate things. They are two different aspects of the same, single reality. Synchronicity, he believed, is a moment when we experience this underlying unity directly. He believed these events were not random. They tended to happen at moments of great psychological significance, often when an archetype has been powerfully activated in the unconscious. The activated archetype creates a kind of psychic energy field, and the external world, for a moment, constellates itself into a pattern that mirrors this inner state. This is why he took ancient systems of divination, like the I Ching or astrology, seriously. He did not believe the I Ching could tell the future. He saw it as a tool for exploring synchronicity. The pattern that the yarrow stalks or the coins create when you throw them is a random, physical event. But the meaning of that pattern, interpreted through the ancient text, he believed, is synchronistically connected to the archetypal, unconscious pattern that is active in your psyche at that exact moment. It is a technique for taking a snapshot of the unconscious. This is Jung's most radical and perhaps most important challenge to our modern rational worldview. He asks us to consider that the universe may not be a cold, dead machine, running on the predictable and meaningless laws of cause and effect. It may also be a living, breathing story. A text that is constantly speaking to us in a language of symbols and meaningful coincidences, if only we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. The most important events in our lives are not the ones that make sense. They are the ones that, for a single shattering moment, break the laws of sense and reveal a deeper and more mysterious order. This radical idea of synchronicity, this belief in a meaningful connection between mind and matter, was not a mere intellectual speculation for Jung. It was a conclusion he was forced to draw from his own direct, and often terrifying, personal experience. To understand the source of his most profound and most controversial ideas, we must now journey with him into the central ordeal of his life. We must descend with him into the crucible where his entire worldview was forged. We must open the pages of his most secret, most personal, and most important work, the book he called Liber Novus, known to the world today as the Red Book. For most of the 20th century, the Red Book was a legend. It was a massive, leather-bound volume filled with Jung's own intricate calligraphy and stunning, mystical paintings, which he kept locked away in a Swiss bank vault. He worked on it for 16 years, and it was not published until half a century after his death. Why was it so secret? Because it is not a scientific treatise. It is the raw, unfiltered, and terrifying journal of a man's soul in a state of near total collapse. It is the record of his personal journey into hell. The journey began around 1913, immediately following his final agonizing break with his father figure, Sigmund Freud. This event, as we have discussed, was a psychological earthquake. It destroyed his professional world and annihilated the personal identity he had so carefully built in the first half of his life. He was in his late 30s, a man at the peak of his career, and he found himself completely and utterly lost. He was plagued by apocalyptic visions of a Europe drowning in a river of blood, visions that would, just a year later, come true with the outbreak of the First World War. He was, in his own words, menaced by a psychosis. He felt his conscious mind, his rational ego, being overwhelmed by a flood of powerful, autonomous, and frightening images erupting from the unconscious. This was his ultimate biographical agony. He had two choices. As a psychiatrist, he knew the conventional path. He could have diagnosed himself as schizophrenic, medicated himself, and tried to repress these terrifying inner experiences. This was the path of safety, the path of the known. But he made a different, far more courageous, and far more dangerous choice. He decided that instead of fleeing from the unconscious, he would turn and face it. He would journey into it deliberately. He would treat his own soul as an undiscovered continent and make himself its first explorer. To do this, he developed a technique he called active imagination. This was not passive daydreaming. It was a conscious, deliberate, and disciplined descent into the inner world. He would enter a waking, meditative state, focus on a dream image or a fantasy, and allow it to come to life. He would then interact with the figures that appeared, speaking to them, questioning them, and treating them as autonomous, intelligent beings. He was, in effect, opening a direct line of communication with the archetypal forces of the collective unconscious. The Red Book is the record of these dialogues. It is a story of his encounters with the strange and powerful inhabitants of his own soul. He meets a figure named Salome, a beautiful but blind young woman who is an embodiment of his own anima. At first, his rational, intellectual ego is dismissive of her, but he slowly learns that she possesses a different kind of wisdom. The wisdom of feeling, of eros, of the heart, that his own one-sided intellect desperately needs. Most importantly, he encounters a figure he calls Philemon. Philemon appears as a wise old man with the wings of a kingfisher. He becomes Jung's inner guru, his spiritual guide in the underworld of the psyche. It was in a dialogue with Philemon that Jung had his most crucial insight. Philemon taught him that the thoughts and figures of the unconscious are not just repressed fragments of the ego. They are not, as Freud might have said, just our own forgotten desires in disguise. They are, Philemon insisted, objective, autonomous psychic realities. They are real beings. The unconscious is not just a part of us, it is a world in itself, and we are not its masters. This was a terrifying and liberating discovery. It was the experiential proof of the collective unconscious. Jung, the scientist, the doctor, had to learn the humility of a student. He had to accept that his own conscious mind was not the only intelligence at work within his own being. This journey was an ordeal of the highest order. Jung wrote that he was constantly in fear of losing his mind, of crossing the line into a psychosis from which he might never return. He had to develop strategies to stay grounded in the everyday world. He continued to see his patients. He remained a devoted husband and father. He took up the physical and earthy work of carving stone at his retreat in Bowling. He had to keep one foot firmly planted in the solid ground of consensual reality, while the other was stepping into a world of gods and demons, of prophetic visions and talking souls. This is what makes his psychology so powerful and so authentic. His map of the psyche was not an abstract theory he invented in a library. It was a map he drew while navigating his own personal hell, a map he had to get right in order to survive. Everything we have discussed in this series, the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, the archetypes, and the ultimate guiding reality of the self, all of these concepts were not theories he created. They were the names he gave to the living, breathing realities he encountered on this terrifying inward journey. The Red Book is the raw, experiential data. His later, more scientific collected works are the organized findings. This is the terrible, secret heart of Jung's entire life's work. He was not a detached scientist observing the psyche from a safe distance. He was his own first and most tormented patient. He had to risk complete and utter madness to discover the map that could lead others to sanity. He journeyed into his own personal hell, and in doing so, he found a vision of the soul that was large enough to contain not only his own darkness, but the darkness of the entire modern world. To heal others, he first had to be willing to be broken himself. This terrifying personal descent into the underworld of the psyche, this direct confrontation with the living archetypes as documented in his Red Book, left Jung with a profound and isolating question. Was he the only one who had ever experienced this? Was he a madman, lost in a private and incomprehensible fantasy, or was he a pioneer, rediscovering the forgotten territory of the human soul? His search for an answer, for a historical precedent, led him away from the modern scientific world of psychology and into one of the most obscure, most misunderstood, and most ridiculed traditions in Western history. For the last 30 years of his life, he embarked on a deep and obsessive study of alchemy. When we hear the word alchemy today, we think of a primitive and foolish pseudo-science. We picture medieval charlatans in dusty laboratories, obsessively trying to turn base metals like lead into literal gold. We see it as a story of greed and scientific ignorance. Jung, after years of painstaking research, came to a completely different and revolutionary conclusion. He argued that the true alchemists were not engaged in a failed attempt at chemistry. They were, unconsciously, engaged in a profound and successful act of psychology. The alchemical process, he discovered, was a symbolic and projected description of the process of individuation. In an age that had no language for psychology, no concepts for the unconscious or the archetypes, the alchemists did the only thing they could. They projected their own inner, psychological transformation onto matter. The transformation of the metals in their flasks and their furnaces was a symbolic mirror of the transformation of their own souls. They thought they were liberating the spirit hidden in matter, but they were actually documenting the liberation of the self from the darkness of the unconscious. To understand this, we must look at the stages of the great alchemical work, the opus. The process begins with the prima materia, the first matter. This was the chaotic, dark, undifferentiated substance that the work began with. Psychologically, Jung saw this as a perfect symbol for the original, unconscious state of the psyche. It is the raw, undeveloped personality, containing all our potential, but also our hidden darkness, our shadow. The first great stage of the work was the negrito, the blackening. This was the stage of decomposition, of putrefaction, of burning the prima materia down to its blackest, most essential state. It was often described as a descent into hell, a dark night of the soul. Psychologically, Jung recognized this as the necessary and agonizing confrontation with the shadow. It is the process of disillusionment, of descending into depression, of facing your own darkness and the darkness of the world. It is the painful but essential act of dissolving the old, naive ego identity. You must, as the alchemist said, cook in your own blackness. Out of this darkness, the second stage emerged. This was the albedo, the whitening. This was a process of purification, of washing the blackened matter until it became a pure, luminous white, like the moon. Psychologically, this represents the great work of illumination and differentiation that comes after the confrontation with the shadow. It is the process of understanding the unconscious. It is where we differentiate the anima and animus, our inner soul images, from the raw darkness of the shadow. It is a moment of profound insight and moral clarity. And this leads to the final triumphant stage, the rubido, the reddening. This is the culmination of the work. It is the creation of the legendary philosopher's stone, the mystical substance that could not only turn lead into gold, but could also heal all diseases and grant eternal life. Psychologically, the philosopher's stone is a symbol of the fully realized self. It is the achievement of individuation. It is the union of the opposites, of conscious and unconscious, of masculine and feminine, of light and dark. The person who has achieved this has created a new, indestructible center for their personality. They are no longer a fragmented ego, but a whole and integrated being. They have the capacity to transform the lead of their ordinary suffering life into the gold of a conscious, meaningful existence. The biographical agony that drove Jung to this strange and ancient art was his own profound intellectual and spiritual isolation. After his break with Freud and his terrifying descent into the unconscious, he was a man in search of a historical anchor. His colleagues in the scientific community saw his experiences as a private psychosis. He spent the last decades of his life in a state of near total scholarly solitude, painstakingly translating these bizarre allegorical texts, written in a secret, symbolic language. He was risking his entire scientific reputation by taking this magical nonsense seriously. But for Jung, this was the most important work of his life. In the strange symbols and cryptic recipes of the alchemists, he found the historical proof he was looking for. He discovered that the terrifying personal journey he had documented in his Red Book was not, in fact, a unique and personal madness. It was the same archetypal journey of transformation that these alchemists had been symbolically mapping for centuries. He was not alone. He was part of a long, hidden tradition of the explorers of the soul. This is the final, great secret that Jung uncovered at the end of his life. He discovered that the most sophisticated map of the human soul was not to be found in the modern clinics of Vienna or Zurich, but was hidden in the dusty, allegorical, and forgotten texts of the medieval alchemists. They thought they were trying to transform lead into gold, but they were unconsciously documenting a far more miraculous process: the transformation of a fragmented psyche into a whole and integrated self. The greatest treasure of their art was not the gold they failed to create in their labs, but the psychological wisdom they unknowingly preserved in their symbols. This deep dive into the strange, symbolic world of alchemy, this exploration of synchronicity and the living reality of the archetypes, represents Jung at his most daring and most controversial. It is the work that, more than any other, opened him up to the most persistent and powerful criticisms that would follow him throughout his career and beyond. To understand Jung fully, to engage with his work with intellectual honesty, we must not only explore his map of the soul, we must also listen to the voices of those who believe that this map leads not to wisdom, but to a land of dangerous, unscientific illusion. The first and most significant charge leveled against Jung is that his work is simply unscientific. From the perspective of a strict empirical science, this is a powerful and difficult critique to refute. The scientific method, especially in psychology, relies on theories that are testable, measurable, and most importantly, falsifiable. A theory is falsifiable if it is possible to conceive of an experiment that could prove it wrong. But how do you design an experiment to prove or disprove the existence of the collective unconscious? How do you measure an archetype? How do you quantify the self? To the scientific materialist, these are not legitimate psychological concepts. They are metaphysical speculations. They are untestable, and therefore they are not science. They belong to the world of philosophy, of poetry, of religion, but not of the clinic or the laboratory. This leads directly to the second great critique, that Jung was not a scientist at all, but a mystic. Critics argue that he abandoned the scientific objectivity of a doctor and instead became a modern Gnostic, a kind of spiritual guru creating his own private religion. They point to his deep immersion in esoteric and spiritual traditions: alchemy, Gnosticism, mythology, Eastern religions. They point to his theory of synchronicity as a departure from the laws of causality. They see his entire project not as psychology, but as a sophisticated and secularized form of theology. The biographical agony for Jung was that he spent his entire life wrestling with this very accusation. He saw himself as a radical empiricist. He insisted that he was not inventing a metaphysics. He was simply a phenomenologist of the soul, a doctor who was honestly and courageously describing what he had observed. He famously said, late in his life, "I do not need to believe in God. I know." For his critics, this was the statement of a mystic. For Jung, it was the statement of an empiricist. He was claiming to have had a direct observable experience of a transpersonal, archetypal reality. His agony was the frustration of knowing that the very subject of his science, the psyche itself, could not be reduced to the simplistic materialistic methods of the other sciences. He was a scientist of a world that science itself had declared off-limits. But the critiques are not just external. There are also profound dangers inherent in the practice of his psychology itself. The most significant of these is the risk of psychological inflation. The journey of individuation, the deliberate engagement with the powerful archetypal forces of the unconscious, is not a safe and gentle process. It is a journey into the fire. When a person has a powerful archetypal experience, when they touch the energy of the hero, the wise old man, or even the self, the ego can be overwhelmed. It can identify with this transpersonal energy. This is inflation. It is a state where a person's small human ego becomes puffed up with a divine archetypal power. It is the psychology of the cult leader, the would-be prophet, the man who believes he has discovered the final answer for all of humanity. Jung was acutely aware of this danger because he had barely avoided it himself during his own confrontation with the unconscious. He knew that the line between a genuine visionary and a man lost in a messiah complex can be terrifyingly thin. Finally, we must address the great misunderstandings that have plagued Jung's work as it has entered popular culture. The first is the reduction of the archetypes to simple stereotypes. The popular use of archetype to mean a fixed character type, the rebel, the lover, the king, is a complete trivialization of his concept. For Jung, the archetypes are not rigid boxes to put people in. They are dynamic, dual-natured, and paradoxical patterns of energy. The Great Mother is both creative and destructive. The hero can also be a fool. His concept was a tool for deepening our understanding of complexity, not for simplifying it into neat labels. And this leads to the most famous misunderstanding of all, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or the MBTI. While the MBTI is based on Jung's theory of types, introversion, extraversion, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, it is a significant simplification of his work. Jung saw the types not as a static label to define who you are, but as a diagnostic tool to understand your own one-sidedness and to guide your own personal growth. The point was not to celebrate that you are an introverted thinker. The point was to recognize that your great and difficult life's work was to develop your inferior, unconscious feeling function. The modern use of these typologies to simply put yourself and others into a box, to say this is who I am, is the exact opposite of the dynamic and lifelong process of individuation that Jung championed. And so we are confronted with the central, unresolved paradox of Carl Jung himself. Was he a scientist who strayed too far into the mists of mysticism? Or was he a mystic who discovered truths about the soul that science is not yet equipped to understand? His greatest strength, his courageous refusal to ignore the irrational, the symbolic, and the spiritual, is the very thing that makes him so vulnerable to the critique of a rational age. He created perhaps the most profound and useful map of the human soul ever devised, and he did so by abandoning the very methods that would have made his map scientifically respectable. This storm of criticism, this great and ongoing debate between science and mysticism, has followed Jung's work for over a century, and yet his ideas have not faded. On the contrary, while many of the psychological theories of his time have become historical footnotes, Jung's vision of the soul has quietly become one of the most profound and influential undercurrents of modern thought. This brings us to our final part, the enduring and ever-growing legacy of the cartographer of the soul. It is true that you will not find Carl Jung at the center of most academic psychology departments today. The university, with its emphasis on measurable data and cognitive behavioral models, has often been uncomfortable with his grand metaphysical and spiritual vision. But his influence is not to be found in the official textbooks, it is found in the very air we breathe. His concepts have so deeply permeated our culture that we use them without even knowing their origin. The idea of the midlife crisis as a necessary turning point. The fundamental distinction between introverts and extraverts, the very idea of archetypes in our stories and our personalities, these are all gifts or borrowings from Jung. He is the foundational figure for what is now known as depth psychology, and his work has been a primary inspiration for humanistic and transpersonal psychology. Schools of thought that insist that the human being is more than just a bundle of conditioned reflexes or repressed traumas. But his most significant legacy may lie outside the formal discipline of psychology altogether. In an age where traditional religious institutions have, for many, lost their authority and their meaning, Jung provided a new language and a new path for the modern spiritual seeker. He offered a way to have a direct personal and experiential relationship with the divine, or what he called the numinous, without having to subscribe to a specific religious dogma. He taught that the divine is not just an idea to be believed in, but a living psychological reality to be encountered within one's own soul. His work provides a bridge for the modern person who is spiritually hungry but intellectually skeptical. He shows us that the ancient myths, the strange religious symbols, the forgotten rituals, these are not just primitive superstitions. They are the sophisticated symbolic language of the human soul. But perhaps his most visible, if often unacknowledged, influence is on the very stories we tell ourselves. In the mid-20th century, a great scholar of mythology named Joseph Campbell, who had been deeply influenced by Jung's work on archetypes and the collective unconscious, wrote a revolutionary book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. In it, Campbell argued that all the great hero myths from all the cultures of the world were in essence telling the same story. He called it the monomyth, or the hero's journey. This is the story of a hero who is called away from their ordinary world, who ventures into a supernatural realm, who faces a series of trials and overcomes a great evil, and who returns with a boon or an elixir to heal their community. This entire framework is a direct application and popularization of Jung's discovery that these are not just random stories, they are the expression of a fundamental archetypal pattern within the collective unconscious itself. And this idea has had an incalculable impact on modern culture. The most famous example is George Lucas, who consciously and deliberately structured his original Star Wars trilogy around the stages of Campbell's hero's journey. Luke Skywalker's journey from a farm boy on a desert planet to a Jedi Knight who confronts the ultimate shadow, Darth Vader, is a perfect, modern retelling of this ancient Jungian myth. The same pattern can be found in The Matrix, in The Lord of the Rings, in the Harry Potter series, and in countless other stories that have shaped our modern imagination. When we are moved by these stories, we are not just being entertained. We are on a deep, unconscious level, recognizing the symbolic map of our own potential journey of individuation. And so, we come to the end of our exploration. We have followed Jung into the darkness of his own soul and emerged with his new map of the psyche. We have met the archetypes. We have charted the course of a human life. What is his final, ultimate message? It is a message that is both a profound comfort and a terrifying challenge. He comforts us with the knowledge that we are not alone. He shows us that our most personal and shameful struggles are, in fact, part of the universal archetypal drama of being human. Our private chaos is part of a cosmic order, but he also challenges us. He challenges us to stop living a one-sided, unconscious, and fragmented life. He challenges us to take our inner lives seriously, to listen to the wisdom of our dreams, and to have the courage to confront our own darkness. He challenges us to undertake the most difficult and most important work a human being can ever do, the work of becoming who we truly are. In the end, the map that Carl Jung created is not a map to a distant mythical land, it is a map to the territory that lies beneath your own feet, within your own soul. His ultimate message is not a comfortable one. It is a call to a difficult and often terrifying adventure. He teaches us that we are infinitely larger and older than we believe ourselves to be, that our modern rational minds are haunted by the wisdom and the madness of a million ancestors. The greatest and most important work a human being can ever do, he insisted, is the work of becoming who they truly are. The final frontier is not outer space, it is inner space. And the great heroic journey of our time is the courageous and ultimately solitary descent into the depths of one's own soul.